It's Sakura Wars! Boy, this series really nails a rare trifecta. It's an old-school Sega franchise that survived into the aughts, it isn't Sonic, and it's actually good. But for all that, it's practically non-existent outside of Japan. We got to talking about this on stream a while back, and since fate really conspired against this series, I want to introduce it to as many cultured individuals as possible. I think the era of VTuber dominance would actually be the perfect time for this franchise to flourish. But how best to explain Sakura Wars to people who've never heard of it? Well, it's a shockingly long-running meta-series starting as a game on the Sega Saturn and turning into a TV series, a theatrical film, a whole bunch of OAVs, several quasi-reboots, a live stage show, and, I think it was a cafe at one point too? The 90s Japanese gaming industry was a different world, man. To quickly give a spoiler-free overview of the setting, it's sort of like a brighter Super Sentai-y version of Persona. A bunch of normies from various walks of life are recruited to pilot demon-slaying mechas while by day past lifing as workers and performers in a Broadway-style theater. The games are structured sort of like Phoenix Wright, with cases being episodes and where the courtroom parts are replaced with Final Fantasy Tactics battles. The playstyle was perhaps a little exotic for overseas audiences way back in the 90s, but would probably be much more familiar to today's mighty future men, what with their otome games and visual novels, used as they are to navigating point-and-click scenarios and choosing dialogue trees with numerous characters, some even leading to romantic story options. Most importantly, you need to navigate dialogue trees with your super team of waifus who use spiritual power to pilot steampunk mechas into battle against nihilistic demons and their cultish worshippers. Simps? The game has a wise cautionary message. Always to simp responsibly, or things get out of hand. The series was easily ahead of its time, not only because it predated the real heyday of hardcore weeb shit gaining traction in the West, but because they tried an early attempt at building what nowadays we'd call a cinematic universe. Both noble endeavors ended up being untenable though, as we'll see. Hey, wait a minute. This game really was ahead of its time. Your dialogue choices will impact not only your teammates' battle stats, but the overall timbre of your relationship, leading to exclusive story scenarios on different playthroughs. So, of the OG cast, you got Sakura Shinguji, who's sort of like the benighted country bumpkin girl who moves to the big capital city and learns to chase her dreams and bip beep bop boop bop boop. There's a haughty aristocratic type who initially doesn't respect Sakura, but eventually she becomes her mentor. There's a tsundere Russian who knows everything about guns, a creepy psychic kid, and a wacky inventor gamer girl whose running gag is that she explodes things. Oh, did I mention it's steampunk? Yeah, everything's steam-powered and There's also a karate lady voiced by Mayumi Tanaka, and the musician Kohei Tanaka was actually the musician for One Piece. Sakura Wars shares a lot of One Piece DNA. Mori Calliope collab when? Eventually, they flesh out the cast further with an Italian opera singer who hates you and a brainwashed kudere. That's good tropes! The reason for the international team of recruits is because so few people exist who can pilot the Kobu spirit armor. Later on, it just sort of becomes a trope, though. Meanwhile, the villains are a bit less conventional. Often the primary antagonist is the vengeful reincarnation of some real-life historical figure. The first game pits the team against Tenkai, a 14th century Tendai monk who teams up with actual biblical Satan to punish Japan for its increasing westernization. The third game has Paris under attack by the vengeful spirits of the Parisi, and the fourth game has Tokyo getting glitter bombed by Okubo Nagayasu, who was a real-life samurai bureaucrat from the Edo period who wants revenge on Tokyo after being accused of wrongdoing after his death and being defiefed. Meanwhile, the main character has to juggle a love triangle of the player's making and arrange a stage adaptation of Les Miserables. I didn't make up any of those plot points. Okay, so I mentioned that their cover operation is a Broadway-style theater show. The conceptual reason for this is based on a pun in Japanese between the words Gekidan, meaning battle squadron, and Gekidan, meaning theater troupe. The in-universe justification is that their musicals instill hope in the hearts of people and help to combat the demonic presence that overshadows the city. Boy, it'd take one hell of a theater troupe to help. Viewer's choice punchline. Anyway, from there it turns into a sort of harem anime, slice of life, fish out of water comedy about a staunch military commander guy having to learn to adapt his leadership style to these wacky and adorable international civilians. Protag Ichiro Ogami must learn how to get along with his teammates while protecting the city from demon-powered robots in a steampunk alternate 20th century replete with culture gap comedy, wacky misunderstandings, pervy Easter eggs, and a minigame where you make borscht. All this while Sega's ever overzealous sound department, headed by composer Kohei Tanaka, generated over 100 original songs to fit the Broadway theme, and by now you're either sold as hell on this whole idea, or you never will be. For the former group, go find a fan sub patch and have yourself a grand old time. For the rest of you, this video is not going to be about anything else. Sorry. Here's Rouge the Bat's dominatrix outfit from Sonic Adventure 2. No doubt the biggest reason this remains an obscure franchise in the West is because it was the flagship title of Sega's ill-fated 32-bit Sega Saturn console. The Saturn is a weird console, man. Usually a system is either a flop or a success everywhere it goes, at least in the 3 major markets. But being an arcade company first and a console manufacturer second, Sega had a keen insight into the demands of the Japanese gaming market. But while arcade boards were a big draw to the Japanese audience, the 90s would witness the swift, separating death of coin-op games in North America. I don't know if this is the case everywhere, but to this day, if you walk into a North American arcade, you won't see Hatsune Miku or Ragnar the Blood Edge, but Galaga and Ms. fucking Pac-Man, with all that implies. Compare also the absolute state of Sega of America's marketing department, which was more or less non-existent by this point. The American ad campaign was the sort of desperate flailing non-strategy that results in this kind of weird art house crap. Meanwhile, in Japan, they had an ad mascot, Segata Sanshiro, played by Kamen Rider actor Hiroshi Fujioka, parodying a protagonist from an Akira Kurosawa film. Sega knew how to market in Japan. Believe it or not, the Saturn was even a legit contender in Japan, even outselling the N64 there. So, while we in the West knew the Saturn as a dead-on-arrival system whose main legacy was an overpromised 3D Sonic game that was never finished, though ironically that wouldn't have kept them from releasing it today, in Japan it was probably most associated with the massive popularity of Waifu Simulator 96. Sakura Wars was such a big deal that the sequel was Sega's big release for 1998, the same year as Ocarina of Time and Metal Gear Solid. They had a very ambitious plan to set up a long line of sequels, but it ended up being rather short-lived. Out of the gate, they planned sequels set in France, New York, and seemed to have foreshadowed eventual forays to South America and Germany as well. The movie and one of the OAVs even start to establish a shadowy, overarching villain organization, which presumably would have been the main antagonist of the New York story. Sakura Wars 3 came out on the Dreamcast and updated the series not only with a new Parisian setting, but an innovative new quasi-turn-based combat system that would become the basis for that used in the Valkyria Chronicles series. It also introduced a new deuteragonist, a nun who's the best girl, clumsy, and nonetheless entrusted with a machine gun. Well, Sakura Wars 3 was released to rave reviews, an accompanying OAV, a new live stage show, and then Sega announced they were discontinuing the Dreamcast and proceeding to be a third-party software developer only. There's this really interesting video that goes into detail about how the change to Sega's corporate strategy affected the Sonic team in particular, but times were tough everywhere, and what followed was a frantic one-year period where the team made Sakura Wars 4, far from continuing the ambitious extended universe they were diligently setting up that could have lasted for years to come. They were compelled to hastily wrap up the entire storyline in a game that can be completed in about 10 hours. Sakura Taisen 4 is alright for what it is, but if you ever see cryptic allusions to it being sort of controversial or the least liked game in the series, this is why. With the future of Sega's game development in question, the mainline game series pretty much had to be scuttled. Some years later, when Sega had its third-party land legs, they finally followed up on that New York setting with Sakura Wars 5, the first game in the series to get localized in North America. Due to how the series was, ended, they were obliged to introduce a brand new protagonist, adjust the story to feature the new set of villains, namely the vengeful ghost of Oda Nobunaga trying to conquer the world from New York. I mean, given what they had to work with, the consensus tends to be that while it's a solid game, it is what you would generally describe as a heavily compromised vision.
We've suffered a fair amount of damage since you've been here.
While it was relatively well received, it proved to be by far the worst selling game of the franchise, and the English localization got delayed until 2010, and mere weeks after Mass Effect 2 and Final Fantasy 13 were released. You see what I mean by the series having fate conspire against it? Still, it's the only game from the old series to get an official Western release, so it's by far the easiest way to start with the series. And I'd say it's worth a trundle to get the full insane experience of witnessing an American cast as imagined by Japanese writers, which naturally includes a team comprised of lawyers and cowboy samurai from Texas. Why are there cowgirl samurai in Texas? Look, man, if we're gonna sit here and ask perfectly reasonable questions, we're gonna be here all day. It might involve ghosts trying to conquer the world with an army of evil spirits, but the real fantasy element is anyone being able to move to New York and afford a single occupancy apartment with room to house a living horse. Other than by playing Sakura Wars 5, if you want to explore the original cast more, probably the simplest way to do so is to look up the old OAVs. The first OAV is a simple origin story showing how all the original team members were recruited prior to the events of the first game.
You must have other reasons for wanting to save the city.
The second, much more popular OAV is a bunch of slice-of-life stories featuring the characters going on miscellaneous adventures in between major incidents from the main story. It's probably hard to find the official DVD prints anymore, but it's probably easy to find stuff on YouTube. And look, I'm surprised how cultured these doggos are. Well, anyway, that's the Sakura Wars series in a nutshell. It deserves so much more. Hopefully they port it to Steam or something. The fan workshops can take it from there. このバカバカしいカヨテは次にどんな忘れたゲームについて説明するかい。後でもっと早く新しいコンテンツを公開できるか。さあまたショーツを作ろう。次回オカスキンガのマジにまたソニック大将さくらにロマンの嵐。